Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'll give a few aspects on the interaction between data protection law and cybersecurity, or what we rather call network and information security. Just a brief, okay. So, just in case there are people in the room who don't know it yet, the European Data Protection Supervisor is the Data Protection Supervisory Authority for the EU. Its own institutions and authorities. It has the same task for the EU level as the national data protection authorities have for the public authorities in national level, on state and regional level. There's 2 elected members appointed by the European Parliament and the Council. And the tasks of the EDPS concern, as I already mentioned, the supervision of the processing of personal data at the institutions. And in addition, we advise the European legislator in its 3 instances of Commission, Parliament, and Council on all matters related to data protection. And my team in particular monitors the development of technologies which have an impact on data protection. And of course, we cooperate a lot with other data protection authorities as well within the EU, currently in the Article 29 Working Party, named after the provision of the current Data Protection Directive, which establishes it, and then in the future under the GDPR and the European Data Protection Board, which replaces this, and to which we will also provide the Secretariat. In data protection, we have some legislation which addresses some of the issues which have been mentioned by the previous speakers. So we have Article 32 on the security of processing, which obliges all organizations to have appropriate security. Security of processing is actually even one of the fundamental principles of data protection as laid down in Article 5 of the GDPR. And the GDPR is the first instrument which establishes a comprehensive obligation to inform the relevant authorities and also, in appropriate circumstances, the individuals concerned when a breach of data security happens. And this is a bit of the text of Article 32, which basically, as we have laid out in guidance which we published last year on how to implement the security provisions on data protection, describes a risk management process which is very much like what you would do as an organization running an IT system, assessing the risks, and then apply a risk management procedure according to what you find in the risks. And the important point just to remember is that this is a dynamic process. It doesn't happen statically or only once, but it's continuous obligation. Before I say a few words on what we see from the recent WannaCry case in this context, let me say that there is actually, through these security provisions in the GDPR, we have one field where the liability is established, because data processors or controllers, organizations that process data, are actually liable, firstly, according to the GDPR, with normal civil liabilities, damages, and they are even sanctionable, because a breach of the provisions on security, when there is neglect or worse behavior on the part of the controller, they are subject to administrative fines of up to 2% of the annual turnover, or 10 million euros, as the paragraph nicely said, whichever is higher. Of course, it doesn't mean that every breach will be fined with a 10 million euro fine, but some circumstances and mitigating measures will be taken into account. And serious efforts by the controller would, of course, lead to a less important fine. In this context, international standards play a role. It's an additional paragraph of Article 32 of the GDPR that the certification according to generally recognized international standards on cybersecurity is an indication that the controller has made serious effort to comply with its obligations. Yeah, a few word WannaCry has already been mentioned, and I think already Lorenzo said it correctly. One thing which we learn from it is if proper security measures are taken, then this actually works. Because there were 10,000s or millions of systems affected, but there were billions of systems which were not affected. And they were not, their survival didn't depend on, or wasn't due to the fact that the attackers weren't interested in these systems. It was basically a mechanism which looked for the opportunity to attack a system and then went ahead, so that it wasn't very selective on that respect. But it meant that they had taken one of the three security measures which would have made the WannaCry attempt ineffective. One thing was to do the security updates. Can give credit to Microsoft that they actually had provided the update to close the vulnerability, I think a couple of months before the attack happened, and everybody who applies urgent security updates within that time frame wasn't affected by that. Those who may not have had this thing could have protected themselves by just disabling the module which contains the vulnerability. That was a file sharing service which is not used on most systems, and so just turning off things that you don't need also can close some vulnerabilities. And the third thing, of course, when someone encrypts your disk, but you have a backup of the disk on a secure device, so if you just throw away the encrypted thing and use the other thing, and you're also fine. But of course, I mean, the first two things are protecting against the actual attack, and the damage, the payload of the attack vector could of course have been something different than the encryption, the ransomware thing. And as we learned, it wasn't very good ransomware because you were not guaranteed to get your data back even if you paid. So that's another thing. The other thing what we learned, or what we saw in this case at a dramatic size, was that and luckily we have already heard about vulnerability management, is that this wasn't something which grew in the wild, where some cyber criminals in the swamps of Southeast Asia or wherever had cooked up the things up, but it had been developed by state officials in Maryland, close to Washington, D.C. The vulnerability was part of a collection of vulnerabilities held by the CIA, and the exploit, so the tool which goes through the hole which is there, had been developed by the NSA. And so you have two of the world's best cybersecurity agencies, and they were not capable of protecting themselves against a cyber attack when their arsenal of cyber weapons was stolen and became public, actually. Just to say in this respect, it's not the end, because it was not only this vulnerability and this exploit that was stolen, but there was a whole collection of more. And we, very seriously hope that the vendors who are all informed about it, because it's public, have or will quickly supply the necessary patches to fix the other vulnerabilities. We didn't want this, but this very strongly supports the concern that the EDPS expressed already in 2015, reacting to a case in Europe where, in that case, an Italian company which is specialized on the production of such exploits, so-called hacking team, was hacked themselves, and their entire disk of several gigabytes was dumped on the web so that everybody could find out what was there. And at that time, we already recommended that there should be some more caution and prudence with states using and collecting this kind of tools. Just to illustrate some future issues, here we have the growth of connected devices, IoT devices, and other things. And according to different estimates, in 3 years there will be billions, hundreds of billions. So anyway, they will. And then if you look at the right-hand side bottom, the estimate is that people may have up to 27 devices on their body or in their possession at all times. And just to say, which is basically my last slide, as you know, in IoT, the S stands for security, and there's a lot of work to do to make it actually visible. And that's it. Thank you very much.